He misses it. Good morning. My name is Evan Weiner, and I think I'm a step closer to appearing live at places. This morning, it's 1961. We're going to go back 60 years. But in some senses, we're not going back 60 years because the same things that plagued the United States in 1961, at least 3 of the 5 things that plagued the United States in 1961, are still there. Now, that is John Kennedy, the young man, great hair, jubilant personality, the new president of the United States. And if you take a look at this picture, you'll see something that you don't see anymore. It's a crowd filled with men wearing top hats. I don't know whatever happened to top hats, but there is John Kennedy after he took the oath of office, giving his ask not what you could do for your country, ask not what your country could do for you, what you could do for your country. And the old president, Dwight Eisenhower, is over to the left, and Lyndon Johnson on the right, Kennedy's left, is next to Kennedy, who's speaking, and the outgoing Vice President, Richard Nixon, is there as well. And there was a dispute over the 1960 election, which is kind of reminiscent to what just happened this year. What was going on in the United States? A threat 90 miles from the United States in Cuba. That hasn't gone away. That's been there since 1959. The civil rights movements, there is Martin Luther King, and the Congress, or at least the House this week, took up a Voting Rights Act. That's what they were talking about in 1961. Eichmann was tried for his war crimes in 1961. 16 years earlier, of course, was the end of World War II and the fall of the Nazi regime. Eichmann was captured in Argentina and faced justice in 1961 in Israel. Vietnam. There really are no big-time American troops in Vietnam yet, but John Kennedy is about ready to send the troops in. This news conference, he talks about Vietnam and where the rebels were in North Vietnam, communist rebel areas, December 20th of 1960, when he wasn't the president. The Cold War. Well, the Cold War hasn't really gone away, has it, since the end of 1945 and the end of World War II. This is the beginning of the Berlin Wall in 1961. Goodbye, Ike. Hello, JFK. Dwight Eisenhower was ending his second term as the president of the United States in January of 1961. But in his final days as president, he made a very, very critical decision, probably the last decision Eisenhower made of any importance. January 3rd, 1961, the United States broke diplomatic relations with Cuba. That was it. No Americans could go there. In fact, the Americans weren't even talking to Fidel Castro. In 1956, Fidel Castro and his associates tried guerrilla warfare as a way of toppling the United States friendly but dictatorship of Batista and his government in Cuba. By 1959, Castro and his associates brought down Batista. Castro would turn to the Soviet Union as his friend. The Cold War was just 90 miles away from the United States shores. Now, 2020, the election was challenged by a whole bunch of people in 2020. 60 years ago, the election was challenged. The election between John Kennedy and Richard Nixon. And it all had to do with the Electoral College. And there were some people who did not want to see John Kennedy become president on January 20th, 1961. Richard Nixon lost to Kennedy, and he decided to get out of it. He was not going to fight Kennedy anymore. It wasn't good for the nation. Let Kennedy be president. Nixon may fight another day. But that was Nixon's decision. But there were others who decided to fight Kennedy and fight him as much as they could and long as they could after the 1960 election. The 1960 presidential race was highly contested. JFK won by a narrow margin. Nixon would concede. But there was a group of politicians who were not happy with what happened. Nixon deciding he's out of there, and they were going to contest the race. Now, the group was made up mostly of white conservative electors from the South, places like Alabama and Mississippi, who opposed JFK's quote-unquote liberal policies, especially his support for civil rights for Black Americans. Now, the Republicans claimed, stop me if you've heard this before recently, the Republicans claimed there was voter fraud in 11 states, and they filed suit in 2 of them, Texas and Illinois, which Kennedy won by fewer than 9,000 votes. The suit in Illinois charged that the Democratic stronghold of Cook County had dug up Kennedy voters from the cemeteries of Chicago, that Richard Daley, the mayor of Chicago, was behind the voters who voted from the cemeteries. Judges threw out both suits in Texas and in Illinois, and Nixon didn't take any part in the both challenges and told a reporter that, quote, "Our country cannot afford the agony of a constitutional crisis. Topple John Kennedy if possible. Don't let him get anywhere near the White House." So what's the strategy? Well, there is a strategy. Going after the Electoral College. Electors from Alabama and Mississippi just won't cast their votes for Kennedy. Kennedy had won both states, but we're not going to cast the votes for him, the electors in the Electoral College. Mississippi's 8 electors and 6 of Alabama's 11 electors said, we're not pledged. We're not going to give you the vote. The electors lobbied their counterparts in other states to aid and abet the plan. Plan A, well, the electors from the 11 southern states would use their clout to persuade Kennedy to stop aid to communist countries and to support states' rights, which was a code for resisting racial integration. If they got Kennedy to do that, yeah, we're all for you. But if Kennedy refused, the electors would go to Plan B, a resolution which called for reversing the position of the candidates in the election, which would mean that the vice president-elect, Lyndon Johnson of Texas, would become president, and Kennedy would be vice president. That was Plan A. Plan B, well, if all doesn't work, let's go for Harry Byrd. Plan C, Republican electors from all the 50 states would meet in Chicago, and they'd pick a president from a list of quote-unquote outstanding Southern men, outstanding Southern men. And here were their choices of the outstanding Southern men. Virginia Senator Harry Byrd. A segregationist governor from Arkansas, Orville Farbus. Another segregationist governor of Mississippi, Russ Barnett. And the Georgia Senator, Richard Russell. Well, in 1960, none of this got resolved to the liking of the people who wanted to upend the election. Byrd would get 15 electoral votes for president in the 1960 election as the unpledged electors from Mississippi, Alabama, and Oklahoma cast their votes for him rather than Kennedy, and the hopes were to delegitimize the Kennedy administration and delegitimize John Kennedy as president of the United States. Simple plan, never worked. And so the goal was to cast doubt over the Kennedy victory, to create the perception that Kennedy's presidency was illegitimate, but at the end of the day, the results stood. John Kennedy, 303 electoral college votes, 34,227,096 votes for him. Richard M. Nixon, the Republican, 219 electoral college votes, 34,107,646 votes for him. And Harry Byrd, who got 116,248 votes, he would get the other electoral college votes. So Kennedy does become president. Civil rights movement, well, that is increased, or the intensity of the civil rights movement is increasing. Eisenhower didn't do all that much during his day. The Supreme Court did the Brown versus Brown Board of Education case with Little Rock. There were a couple civil rights bills that were signed into law, but Kennedy inherits a mess. And he's pretty much sitting on his hands, not doing all that much of anything. That's January the 12th. Actually, the picture is from January 11th. At the University of Georgia, Charlene Hunter, who was 18 years old in 1961, started classes at the school under a federal order. But that order was withdrawn, or she withdrew from classes on January 11th for her own protection when students staged an uprising against integration, a segregated school, University of Georgia. Meanwhile, a couple days later, Dwight Eisenhower says goodbye, January 17th, 1961, and he left with a warning. And that warning, 60 years later, is still being uttered by some people around Washington and in academia. It was January 17th that Dwight Eisenhower ended his presidential term by giving his final speech, warning the nation about the increasing power of the military-industrial complex. This is what Eisenhower said, and some of these words still hold true 60 years later. As we peer into society's future, we, you and I, in our government, must avoid the impulse to live only for today, plundering for our own ease and convenience the precious resources of tomorrow. We cannot mortgage the material assets of our grandchildren, people like me now, without asking the loss of their political and spiritual heritage. So from the oldest president at the time, Dwight Eisenhower was 70 years old, soon to be 71, to the youngest, John Kennedy, who was 43 years old. John Kennedy with that mop of hair, John Kennedy who looked like he always had a suntan, but as we found out later on in life, looks could be very deceiving. John Kennedy wasn't all that healthy. Eisenhower was probably healthier than he was at the age of 70, he being 43. Ask not, what's your country? Well, there is the young family. Kennedy with his kids, Caroline and John John. John John is just about 2 years old, something like that. Less than 2 years old. With their pony at the White House. At the age of 43, the youngest man ever elected president, although Theodore Roosevelt was younger, but he took over after the assassination of William McKinley in 1901. Image was everything. Perceived perception, which is a big thing in my business, in the media business. People perceive something, and that's the perception you got. Image is everything. John Kennedy, he had thick hair. He had cool sunglasses. Jackie was 29 years old, Jacqueline Bouvier Kennedy. She was stylish. She's only 29. She had 2 small children. There were touch football games in Massachusetts at the Kennedy compound. There were touch football games on the White House lawn. And he was also a World War II hero, PT 109. They did a movie about him. Cliff Robinson played JFK. He was a World War II hero, saving his men after his patrol boat was sunk. He was Camelot. Well, maybe not. Camelot came after JFK was assassinated. But it's all image. Look at that image. Jackie with the pillbox hat and the clothes, and John Kennedy with the hair and the grin and the joke. And he was funny. He knew how to tell a joke. But JFK's world was totally different than what the perceived perception was. And if you take a look at this list, Cold War, Cuba, Civil Rights Movement, Vietnam, the space race. Those were his 5 issues. In 2021, there is a Cold War going on between Russia and the United States. There's a Cold War going on between China and the United States. A little different nomenclature, but it's still basically a Cold War going on. Cuba is still in the same position it was in 1961. There's a ban on travel to Cuba right now. Civil rights movement. The House took up a Voters' Rights Act this week and passed it. It's going ahead to the Senate. Vietnam. Well, Vietnam, there was action there. There was the Civil War between the North and South, which started in 1954 after France pulled out. And the space race. There's no space race anymore. The space race was a big deal. It was part of the Cold War. at that time. And before John F. Kennedy makes his famous speech, "We'll go to the moon," there really wasn't any rhyme and reason as to where the space race was going. Adolf Eichmann. Adolf Eichmann is being tried in Israel for Nazi war crimes. On May 23rd, 1960, the Israeli Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion announced that the Nazi war criminal Adolf Eichmann was captured and would stand trial in Israel. Eichmann, the Nazi SS officer who organized Adolf Hitler's final solution of the Jewish question, was seized by Israeli agents in Argentina on May 11th of 1960 and smuggled to Israel 9 days later. On April 11th, 1961, Eichmann's trial began in Jerusalem. It was the first trial to be televised in history, globally. TV is becoming mature by this point. Most areas in the United States had TV by this time and multiple TV stations. Eichmann faced 15 charges, including crimes against humanity, crimes against the Jewish people, and war crimes. He claimed, "I was just following orders," but the judges disagreed, finding him guilty on all counts on December 15th, 1961, sentencing him to die. On May 31st, 1962, he was hanged near Tel Aviv. His body was subsequently cremated and his ashes thrown into the sea. Cuba is a big problem. Dwight Eisenhower had recruited a bunch of Cuban exiles who left after Castro took over in 1959, and they were doing some training, but Eisenhower never really had a plan to go ahead to invade Cuba. Left it on the table to his successor, John Kennedy. John Kennedy didn't take advice from Eisenhower, didn't take much advice from too many people. Hey, there's a Harvard guy. He knew what he was doing. He didn't need advice. He could make his own decisions. Also, he had been in the Congress since 1947 and the Senate since the 1950s. So he kind of knew what was going on in Washington, although there is nothing that distinguished him from any other senator while he was serving as the Massachusetts senator in the 1950s. So the Bay of Pigs mission takes place. A brigade of around 1,500 CIA-trained Cuban exile soldiers stormed the beach in Cuba's Bay of Pigs. It was part of a secret mission to overthrow Fidel Castro and halt the spread of communism throughout the world. It was a miserable failure. Partly, Kennedy didn't listen to advisors and didn't really use his military assets. The mission was set into motion on April 15th with a series of airstrikes to take out Castro's defenses. The plan was not executed well, and they missed the Cuban planes. On April 16th, Kennedy said no series of second strikes. He got the Air Force out of there. Now, that is Castro during the Bay of Pigs invasion. Without any air support, Kennedy pulls the air support on April 16th. Most of the April 17th invaders were taken prisoners, or 90 were killed. Castro would become entrenched because of this. The ties with the Soviet Union would strengthen. The Cuban exiled invaders were eventually released from Cuban prisons between 1962 and 1965. And there was a deal cut with the United States because the United States would send $53 million worth of food and medicine to the island nation in exchange for the prisoners. The civil rights movement, well, the Freedom Riders are out there, and they're going to the South, and they are going to help with the civil rights movement. I did a talk the other day on the calendar year 1960 with a seniors group, and that was down in Florida. And a woman was telling me how she didn't go on the Freedom Rides. She was part of the sit-ins. People who refused to leave department store lunch counters because of the discrimination against African Americans who wouldn't be served. I've never met anybody who was actually on one of these buses. The Freedom Riders rode interstate buses into segregated southern United States areas starting in 1961 to challenge the non-enforcement of the United States Supreme Court decisions, Morgan against Virginia, Boynton against Virginia, 1946 and 1960s, which ruled that segregated public buses were unconstitutional. The southern states, state rules, and states' rights rather. The southern states ignored the rulings, and the federal government did nothing to enforce them. They would eventually in 1961, later in the year. The first Freedom Ride left Washington, D.C. on May 4th, went down to New Orleans. I was in New Orleans 2 years ago today at Mardi Gras. Long time ago, it seems. Anyway, they go to New Orleans, scheduled to arrive on May 17th, and they were encountered by not the S&H green stamp sign. I used to have S&H green stamps. But anyway, they were encountered by people who looked to do them harm, doing things like firebombing Greyhound buses. On May 14th, Mother's Day, angry white people blocked a Greyhound bus carrying black and white passengers through rural Alabama. The attackers pelted the vehicle with rocks and bricks, slashed tires, smashed windows with pipes and axes, lobbed a firebomb through a broken window. Smoke and flames filled the bus. The mob barricaded the bus, yelling, "Burn them alive." John Lewis passed away last year. John Lewis was a college student back in 1961. The congressman from Georgia, he was arrested in Jackson, Mississippi in 1961 as part of the protests back in 1961. On May 24th, Martin Luther King in Atlanta tried to buy a bus ticket to go on the Freedom Rides. John Kennedy wasn't doing anything. He was sitting around. He was just watching what was going on. He was rather slow to react. In 1960, he did campaign on doing something. And in 1960, he called Coretta Scott King, who was the wife of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, after he was imprisoned on trumped-up charges in Atlanta after leading a sit-in. Most of the others who were arrested were let go. Robert Kennedy, who is the campaign manager in 1960 for JFK, made a call to get Martin Luther King out of jail the next day. The calls went unnoticed during the campaign. They were kept quiet somewhat. In 1961, JFK sat on his hands, did nothing about housing segregation. But in November, Robert Kennedy's May 29th memo to end segregation of interstate busing took effect, which allowed Northerners to ride the Greyhound buses, the Trailway buses, and others to go to the South to be part of demonstrations. Vietnam, there's been a war there for 7 years. January 19th, the final meeting between Eisenhower and Kennedy, with Eisenhower as the president. Eisenhower did not mention Vietnam as one of the major problems facing the United States. Kind of odd. But he didn't think Vietnam was the big deal. He thought Laos was the big deal. He described Laos as the keystone to Southeast Asia. Eisenhower thought Laos was a weak country. And if you lose Laos, if they're toppled by the communists, then you would lose most of the Far East to communism. It's called the domino theory. And China was gone. Since 1949, Mao Zedong led a revolution kicking out Chiang Kai-shek, who went to Taiwan. North Korea, North Vietnam. The next thing in the domino would be Laos and Cambodia, then Thailand and Malaysia and Indonesia, then Burma and then India. After the 1954 Indochina pullout, Eisenhower was worried about the loss of Vietnam to communist control. And if that happened, all of those other countries, even Australia and New Zealand, would go communist. His quote was, "The possible consequences of the loss are just incalculable to the free world." In his last days as president, Eisenhower's last days as president, the Soviet Union Premier Nikita Khrushchev pledged support for the wars of national liberation throughout the world. And the North Vietnamese leader Ho Chi Minh is listening. John Kennedy comes into office determined not to lose South Vietnam. There's no way he is going to lose South Vietnam. And he's got his ally Diem in South Vietnam, sort of a corrupt leader who's running South Vietnam. There have been some coup attempts against him over the years, but that was Eisenhower's guy. That's going to be Kennedy's guy. In 1961, in May, He sends 400 American Green Berets special advisors to South Vietnam to train South Vietnamese soldiers in the methods of counterinsurgency in the fight against Viet Cong guerrillas. Viet Cong were so named in December of 1960. On October 24th, 1961, on the 6th anniversary of the founding of the Republic of South Vietnam, Kennedy sends a letter to Diem and pledges the United States is determined to help Vietnam, South Vietnam, preserve its independence. More military advisors go, along with American helicopter units, transport and direct South Vietnamese troops into battle. Kennedy wants to prevent a communist takeover of South Vietnam, which is in accordance to the policy of the government of the United States, which it had been followed since 1954. Meanwhile, up in Korea, that war never ended. Actually, it wasn't a war. It was a police action that started in 1950 with a truce in 1953. So the Korean police action isn't over, and there's a skirmish here in 1961, as you could see, near the border between the Americans and the North Koreans. The space race. When I was a kid, I loved watching the space race. I used to watch old Cronkite on CBS, and there goes the Mercury 7, or there goes the Gemini 8. Man enters space. And it was not the Americans that sent a satellite into space, manned satellite into space. It was the Soviets. So close yet so far, size Cape. U.S. had hoped for its own launch. Yuri Gagarin was the guy who went into space. The Soviets had beaten the Americans in getting a space satellite up into orbit, 1957, Sputnik, October 4th, 1957. Soviets, now the Russians, still using that Sputnik term. The coronavirus vaccine, COVID-19 vaccine that the Russians put out is called Sputnik 5. April 12th, Gagarin, the cosmonaut, becomes the first human in space. He makes a 108-minute orbital flight, 1 hour and 48 minutes, in the Vostok 1 spacecraft. Less than a month later, Alan Shepard would go into a suborbital flight, 15 minutes, and that was it, 15 minutes long. That would be in May of 1961. And there is Gagarin with one of the higher ranking, but not the highest ranking Soviet Union official in those days, Leonid Brezhnev, who eventually would take over from Khrushchev in 1964. Shepard, May 5th, suborbital, 15 minutes. And there was a problem with that one. It kept getting delayed and delayed and delayed, and Alan Shepard had to go to the bathroom and ask whether or not he could come down. They wouldn't let him, so he had to do his thing in his pants, let everybody know. And he also quipped that because it was a government job, and the government put out bids for the Mercury spacecraft, that he was sitting on a payload of the lowest bidders. I guess he was having fun as he was waiting to take off back on May 5th, 1961. JFK in the space program. Here he's pinning a medal on Shepard. There are some of the other the Mercury astronauts, Gus Grissom behind John Glenn there, Scott Carpenter there, and Cooper there, Lyndon Johnson there. Kennedy wasn't too thrilled with the space program. The only thing that he wanted to do was to make sure that the American man would be the first to walk on the moon, not the Soviets. And so all his efforts were thrown into just get the man on the moon. I don't care about anything else. The Soviet space probe, the Venera 1, becomes the first man-made vehicle to reach another planet when it arrives at Venus. On May 25th, Kennedy announces his goal for the rest of the decade. Before a special joint session of Congress, he says the goal of sending an American safely to the moon before the end of the decade has to happen. In general, Kennedy felt great pressure to have the United States catch up and overtake the Soviet Union in the space race. In fact, in 1960, Kennedy ran on a platform that included a missile gap, which really didn't exist. But the Pentagon liked it because there was going to be more spending on military, on the military. But Kennedy perceived there was a gap in the space race as well. The space race was part of the Cold War. And in Kennedy's mind, America was losing. The June summit between Nikita Khrushchev and John F. Kennedy bombs. It lays an egg. On June 4th, Kennedy and Khrushchev meet at the Vienna summit in Austria. Kennedy told the New York Times, a reporter with the Times, that Khrushchev savaged me. Khrushchev had more to say than that. This man's very inexperienced, even immature. Compared to him, Eisenhower's a man of intellect and vision. Khrushchev used that kind of language about Mao Zedong and others. Khrushchev was pretty colorful that way. Kennedy ignored warnings from his advisors. Like I said, he didn't listen to anybody. He knew what was best. He didn't have to listen to his advisors. Not to say things like, or say things or debate communism or communist ideology. This got him stuck in time-wasting discussions about Marxism. He talked about it. Kennedy spent a lot of time defending aspects of pre-World War II status quo, like in British imperialism, which had nothing to do with what was going on in 1961. Kennedy also told Khrushchev he considered Sino-Soviet forces and U.S. Western European forces to be fairly equally balanced. They both had enough firepower to wipe out the world. Kennedy and Khrushchev continued to communicate afterwards. Both came to this understanding eventually that neither wanted nuclear war. You remember that? Duck and cover? Duck and cover. In a July 25th speech, Kennedy emphasized that any attack on Berlin, Germany, West Berlin, is an attack on NATO. In 1949, Belgium, and the attack would come from the Soviet Union, of course, or East Germany. In 1949, Belgium, Canada, Denmark, France, Iceland, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, Portugal, the United Kingdom, and the United States founded the North American Treaty Organization, or NATO. Three other members came in 1952, Greece and Turkey, and West Germany in 1955. 2 weeks later, Dean Rusk sounds the alarm. He's the Secretary of State, and he tells NATO, be prepared for anything. And that anything was the construction of the Berlin Wall, which kept West Berliners separated from East Berliners in East Germany. And there is the beginning of the East Berlin Wall, which would stand until Ronald Reagan told Gorbachev in the 1980s, tear down that wall, which they did. Construction of the wall was commenced by the German Democratic Republic, or East Germany, on August 13th. The wall cut off West Berlin from surrounding East Germany, including East Berlin. The barriers included guard towers placed along large concrete walls, accompanied by a wide area that contained anti-vehicle trenches, beds of nails, and other defenses. And there is the building of the Berlin Wall. You can see the cinder blocks there. In 1955, the Soviets gave East Germany the authority over civilian movement in Berlin, passing control to a regime not recognized in the West. Initially, East Germany granted visas to allow its residents to access West Germany. However, there was a defection of a good number of East Germans to the West, and the new German state legally restricted virtually all travel to the West in 1956. And there is the wall that separated East Berlin and West Berlin. With the closing of the East-West sector boundary in Berlin, the vast majority of East Germans could no longer travel or emigrate to West Germany. Many families were split. East Berliners employed in the West lost their jobs. West Berlin became an isolated enclave in a hostile land. West Berliners demonstrated against the wall, led by the mayor, Willy Brandt, who strongly criticized the United States for failing to respond to the building of the wall, criticizing John Kennedy. But the wall didn't stop everybody. There's a guy who is escaping or trying to escape, and he did. Now, that's Times Square, roughly 1961, and there was all this stuff about nuclear war. Times Square is cleaned out, a drill, just in case. The Astor Hotel, that's not there anymore. Woolworths, that's not there anymore. Nor is Bond Clothes, two trouser suit. That's all gone, of course. But in 1961, there were civil defense drills, which alerted people to the fact that the Cold War was a thing in reality. Hiding under desks. You don't see too many of these things, the fallout shelter, but you did when 60 years ago, I remember PS 151 seeing a fallout shelter sign. You hid under your desks like that. On September 15th, there were a lot of people who subscribed to Life magazine, and they got a letter from John Kennedy. Oh, cool, a letter from John Kennedy inside of Life magazine in the plastic. But it wasn't a good letter. The news was not very good. My fellow Americans, he wrote, nuclear weapons and the possibility of nuclear war are facts of life we cannot ignore today or can ignore in 2021. Enter the fallout shelter. Oh, the federal government would soon begin a program to improve protection afforded you in your communities through civil defense. There were fallout shelters. Oh, they weren't going to protect people from an exploding bomb, just like going like that's not going to protect you from an exploding bomb. Ask my teacher about that when I was 7 years old. She said, shut up and get under the desk. Never got an answer from her. But people away from the bomb might get some protection from bomb materials that were scattered, would be scattered for weeks after the attack. There would be some food and other necessities available in this fallout shelter. On October 29, 1961, the USSR detonates a 50 megaton hydrogen bomb in the largest man-made explosion in history. And there was your fallout shelter, a fancier one if you wanted to buy one. There's where survivalists still sell these things today. Canned water, canned food, places to sleep. They got your own latrine in there, and you could actually survive in there for a little while. That was a fancier shelter. Goodbye, 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 Joe Stalin. Joe Stalin was dead for a long time by this point, but Soviet Union decided we got to get rid of Uncle Joe. So Joseph Stalin begins, the beginning of the erasing of Stalin from the memory of the Soviet Union starts. Goodbye, Uncle Joe. The Soviet Party Congress unanimously approves a resolution removing Stalin's body from Lenin's tomb and Red Square in Moscow as part of the de-Stalinization efforts. He had been dead 8 years by that point. The Peace Corps started in the United States. The goal here was send Americans to countries around the world to combat the ugly American. Remember, there was a book at that point, The Ugly American, to combat the ugly American stereotype. That started on March 1st, 1961, the Executive Order 10924. Kennedy signs it. It starts the Peace Corps, and they were concerned with what was going on in the decolonialized world, where countries were popping up in Africa and other places, particularly in Africa in 1960, the Third World. Kennedy saw the Peace Corps as a means of countering the stereotype of the ugly American in Yankee imperialism, especially in Africa and Asia. Kennedy appointed his brother-in-law, Sergeant Shriver, to be the program's first director. The Peace Corps was born during the Cold War. What they really wanted to do was create an agency designed to capture and win the hearts and minds of the developing countries who had not yet chosen which side they were going to be on in Africa. In 1960 was the year of African independence. 17 countries said, we're out of here, to France and England, mostly to France. And the continent was beginning to see life without France, life without England, and also the beginning of the opposition to the South African apartheid government. In 1960s, France cut loose all of the French colonies in West Africa and French equatorial Africa, all gone. Guyana was the first country to welcome the Peace Corps. The first group of volunteers arrived in Ghana August 30th. By year's end, there were 500 Peace Corps volunteers serving in Chile, Colombia, Ghana, India, Nigeria, the Philippines, St. Lucia, Tanzania, and Pakistan. But the Soviets, Khrushchev, no, he didn't think this was all that good. In fact, he thought all these kids who said they were Peace Corps volunteers were actually getting paid as American spies. Meanwhile, back in the USSR, or back in the USA, Chuck Berry, back in the USA, Beatles back in the USSR, there is George Lincoln Rockwell, right there, head of the American Nazi Party. We do hate race and mixing. Lincoln Rockwell, George Lincoln Rockwell's hate bus, which I believe is a Volkswagen, getting fire chief gasoline at a Texaco station. No doubt they got the S&H green stamps too. Here's a freedom rider, Joan Trumpauer. She's arrested on June 8, 1961 by the Jackson, Mississippi Police Department. She was a 19-year-old Duke student and part-time secretary in the Washington office of Senator Claire Eagle of California. She arrived in Jackson, Mississippi to take part in the Mississippi Freedom Ride. She and 8 others were arrested. They were refused bail. She spent 3 months in jail, later enrolling in a traditionally black Tougaloo college, which had just accepted white students. Albany, Georgia. There's another thing going on down in Albany, Georgia. There's a march and there's a rally. That starts in November of 1961. It was the first mass movement in the modern civil rights era to have as its goal the desegregation of an entire community, the city of Albany, Georgia. More than 1,000 African Americans were jailed in Albany and surrounding rural counties. But it turns out to be a failure. Martin Luther King ends up in Albany in December of 1961, and he sees the black protesters and himself are being arrested in the week. He would leave Albany months later saying that he personally had failed to accomplish his movement's goals, which was to desegregate Albany, Georgia. But voter registration would increase. Remember now, the House of Representatives in the year 2021 passed a Voters' Rights Act in 2021. It's up at the Senate right now. 60 years later, you're seeing the same thing repeat. 60 years later, there was no Voters' Rights Act. That wouldn't come until 1965. But voter registration would increase in the South. African-American businessman Thomas Chapman secured enough votes in an election in Albany for a city commission seat to force a runoff election. In spring of 1962, the Albany City Commission removed all the segregation statutes and laws from its books, making it an open election without poll tax or anything else, literacy taxes. Meanwhile, in New York, not far from you, New Rochelle, May 31st, 1961, the judge, Irvin Kaufman, orders the Board of Education of New Rochelle, New York to integrate. In Garner versus Louisiana, the court overruled the disturbing the peace convictions of 5 African Americans who had engaged in sit-ins at an all-white restaurant counter in Baton Rouge. On September 20th, James Meredith, a student at the all-black Jackson State College, filed a lawsuit against the University of Mississippi alleging racial discrimination. The case was eventually settled in 1962 on appeal by the U.S. Supreme Court, which ruled in favor of Meredith attending the University of Mississippi in September of 1962. Who would think, who would have ever thought this? Francisco Franco, civil rights pioneer, the fascist dictator of Spain, yet a civil rights pioneer? Yeah, he was. Yeah, he was. He really was. On July 22nd, 1961, equal rights for women in the workplace, including pay. The fascist leader, Francisco Franco, a change in the law made it easier for women to gain employment in the public sector. Women in Spain face many restrictions, including the need for their husband to approve their job before allowing them to sign an employment contract. In the United States, if you're a woman looking for a credit card in 1961, you needed your father, your brother, your husband, or a best friend, all male, to co-sign that you're cool to get a credit card. Women didn't have equal opportunities in education in the United States in 1961, but here's Francisco Franco, The 1961 law gave women in the workplace additional rights they had previously lacked by recognizing the importance of their work. The law entitled single women to have a salary equal to that of her male peers in the same job. That still hasn't happened in the United States. In 1963, the first law would come up, equal rights for women in the workplace for equal pay, but it was never enforced. The more things change, the more things stay the same. June 24th, the Iraqi government threatened to invade Kuwait, and the invasion was finally averted by plans by the Arab League to form an international Arab force against the Iraqi designs in Kuwait in 1961. Of course, the United States fought a war back in 1990 when Saddam Hussein of Iraq invaded Kuwait. No more diapers, cloth diapers. Wow, 1961. Your kid could have paper diapers. Pampers. Pampers is introduced to the marketplace. Baseball changes as well. There's the 16-team league. The 16-team league is gone. The American League expands by 2 teams to Los Angeles and into Minnesota. So baseball changes, and Roger Maris hits his 61st home run of the season, last day of the season, to break Babe Ruth's record. Here he is with Sal Durante, who caught the ball in Yankee Stadium afterwards. So 1961 is the first year of the 18 major league teams. The American League approved the transfer of the Washington Senators to Minneapolis and expanded by 2 teams that started in 1961. One in Los Angeles, the other returns a team to Washington. The American League adopted a 162-game schedule in 1961, and that would come back and haunt the American League or Major League Baseball in this sense. It's a 162-game schedule, not 154, which means if anybody hits more home runs than Babe Ruth and does it after 154 games, it wouldn't be a new baseball record. Maris hits his home run 61 on October 1st. He has a new home run record. He eclipses Babe Ruth's record of 60, but he does that in a 162-game schedule. Babe Ruth hit his 60 home runs in the 154-game schedule in 1927. And there's some chicanery around here as well. The baseball commissioner is Ford Frick. Ford Frick was an old sports writer. He knew Babe. He was friends with Babe's widow. And he wanted to make sure the integrity of Babe Ruth's record, because Babe Ruth was bigger than baseball, would hold up. And maybe there would be an asterisk put next to Roger Maris saying, well, yeah, he hit the record, but he did it in all these games. Eventually that would go away, and Roger Maris would be recognized as the home run king for one season with his 61, and Barry Bonds and McGuire and Sosa eventually would break that record. Oh yeah, here's another thing that started in 1961. The Ken doll. Barbie needed a boyfriend, and she got one. The Ken doll. That doll's got to be worth a lot of money now. Everyday life changes in 1961, sort of. Electric toothbrushes introduced. Bobby Roberts gets a boyfriend, Ken. Frito corn chips appear. Boy, life gets easier, doesn't it? The legacy of 1961. Well, here it is. The civil rights movement would continue. John F. Kennedy didn't do very much in 1962 as far as the civil rights movement was concerned. James Meredith did get into the University of Mississippi, and Kennedy did help that situation. But he didn't do much in 1963. He did start to support the cause after the Birmingham riots in early May of 1963, where he saw on the cover of the New York Times a dog attack police dog attacked one of the demonstrators. And television sent camera crews down to Birmingham to see what was going on, and what they reported back embarrassed the United States. The situation in Cuba would come to a head in 1962 with the Cuban Missile Crisis. a lot of mythology around the Cuban Missile Crisis, what happened and what really happened. And we found out in 1997 that the Cuban Missile Crisis wasn't exactly as intense as it was appeared to be in 1962. The United States would continue to support the South Vietnamese. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution in 1964, August 7th, 1964, gave the president, Lyndon Johnson, full authority to go all out in South Vietnam. In 1961, the Senate Majority Leader, Mike Mansfield, Democrat from Montana, had an idea. Let's get rid of the Electoral College. We don't need the Electoral College anymore. What's the purpose? What is the purpose of the Electoral College? Because back in the day, the only people who could vote, the George Washington days or the John Adams days, were landowners. And there was an Electoral College to oversee to make sure that the right people won. But what was the point? If you got the popular vote in any other election, there was no Electoral College. And so Mike Mansfield advanced this idea in 1961. Still talked about in 2021. Why do we need an Electoral College? As far as Iraq, Iraq would invade Kuwait in 1990, 29 years after Iraq first threatened to invade Kuwait. Iraq has always felt that Kuwait is just a part of Iraq and it's just a breakaway state or province. Of course, John F. Kennedy would be killed in 1963 on November 22nd, 1963. Kennedy did not have a good first year in 1961. The Bay of Pigs left a legacy. The legacy is that Cuba never forgave him. And that would lead to the Cuban Missile Crisis. And they tried to kill Fidel Castro at every possible way they could in 1961, 1962. Kennedy would lower the tax rate in 1961. It had been 91%, but if you reinvested in your business, you wouldn't pay the 91%. The Rust Belt would start rusting in 1961 more and more. And but Kennedy was a very popular president, did a lot of news conferences, but the United States had its problems, Africa had its problems, and the Soviets and the Chinese didn't like each other anymore. That started in 1959, accelerated in 1960, and would accelerate more in 1961, 1962, 1963. Well, so that was the year that was, 1961. The twist was a big thing. Women's liberation was a thing that hadn't started yet, but Betty Friedan started thinking about, I'm going to write a magazine article about women and their lack of rights, being housewives and not being able to get jobs unless they were nurses, secretaries, teachers, or phone operators. You never heard of a man being a phone operator back in 1961, but that would come to pass also. Anyway, I want to thank Mathia for inviting me. If you have any questions, any comments, let me know. I'm going to pause the recording now. Anybody have anything to say? If not, we'll end it and I'll send it to Mathia, and we'll see you next month when we will continue in this series for 1962. And I believe that's April 2nd, which is my birthday, April 2nd. So I'm going to be giving you a talk on my birthday. Anybody have anything to say? Well, if not, thank you so much for listening, and I will send a copy of this, and we will see you next month. Stay safe, take care, have a good weekend. Bye-bye. I'm Evan Weiner. Good afternoon.